There we go. Oh my goodness. Okay, that's better. Which is one of the more remarkable buildings on campus. I'm proud to be part of a community that takes so seriously questions of faith and learning, not only in politics, my own field, but also philosophy, theology, literature, and the arts, and also the sciences, and in the natural sciences in particular. Scientific ethics, questions of scientific responsibility, issues in the interplay in science and faith. These are live questions here at Gordon and in society more generally. And these are the types of questions with which JAF is primarily concerned. Our central question for the program, what does Jerusalem have to do with Athens? It's an important sense asking, how do people of faith relate to culture? And it's hard to imagine anything more central to our culture today than scientific discovery. And so I'm grateful to these students for agreeing to lead us in this conversation tonight. The resolution to be debated tonight reads as follows. You can read it as well up on behind me. Humanity should not embrace the de-extinction of species. It's important to know that these students have been given this topic. They're not necessarily experts in it, though this is an example of the type of conversations we have in JAF all the time. This isn't a course in the sciences per se. It's important to know that they received this topic before the beginning of the current semester, and they were divided into two groups, and they've had to do all the research and work on this independently. So I and my co-director, Dr. Hevlon Harper, we've done virtually nothing. We'll be as surprised and as interested as any of you are in what we hear tonight. It's also important to know that the students are not arguing for positions that they personally hold. Maybe they do and maybe they don't. Maybe their views have changed over the course of the semester. But this is intended as an exercise in oratory, at putting the best face on a position. And I encourage students who are here to consider attending the symposium event on Thursday that JAF is sponsoring, where you can be able to get a little more of a behind-the-scenes look at the JAF debate process, and the students will have a chance to talk a little more personally and informally about the process. That event is at 2, I believe, on Thursday. You can check the symposium schedule for details. Let me go over the format and then say a little about your role, because the audience, both the audience here in the auditorium and the audience at home, you have a very important role to play this evening. Our debate is highly structured. It's in the Oxford style with alternating statements that are time limited. And we will be beginning with an opening statement by the pro team and a rebuttal from the con team, and this will continue in sequence back and forth. Joanna Wells, our program coordinator, will be our timekeeper so that they don't go over their time. Once we hear all the statements and the rebuttals, then there will be time for questions from the audience. In the auditorium, there will be mics available, and if you're attending virtually, you'll be able to email your questions to jaf@gordon.edu. And Kat Corbin, who some of you may remember as a participant in last year's debate, will be bringing forward the questions that are sent in via email. And I'll be asking that your question be succinct, that it not be a long comment, but that it be a relatively short comment or question that is directed to one team or to the other. And then there will also be time for the teams to ask questions of each other, if there's something they think has not been adequately addressed, or if they want to weigh in on another point. At the conclusion of the debate, after the concluding statements, we'll ask both teams to leave the room, and then our audience, the audience here and the audience at home, will vote on which team they believe made the most compelling case for its position. And this is very important. We'll not be asking you to vote on what you actually think of the resolution. Rather, we're sort of asking you to step outside of yourself and consider who made the most compelling case for their position. This is a little challenging. You shouldn't be influenced by other things like who is in your dorm or who you play a sports team with or whatever, rather on the quality of the argument. This is really vital for the process, and it shows proper respect. The JAFers have put a tremendous amount of work, research into their argument, and they're expecting you, the audience, to put effort into listening and deciding who made the best case for their position. Let me introduce them now. I'll introduce them one team at a time. For the affirmative case, we have Baraka Kamal, Madeline Miaris, Sam Paquette, Josh Powell, Jasmine Rupani, Grace Zhao, and Serafina Zotter. And on the negative case, we have Jacob Gerwig, Jay Koom, John Skoog, Emma Vanderbrake, Ginny Vino, and Kate Walker. Let me read the resolution one more time, and then we'll turn things over to them. Humanity should not embrace the de-extinction of species. We begin with the opening statement for the pro team.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the 17th Annual Jerusalem Athens Forum debate. The resolution of our debate this evening is resolved that humanity should not embrace the de-extinction of species. My team and I stand in affirmation of this statement, and throughout this debate, we will demonstrate that the de-extinction of species is not a worthy cause for humanity to pursue with vigor. I will first define the term de-extinction. The de-extinction of species is the production of organisms resembling an extinct species by methods of cloning, gene editing, or selective breeding of a closely related living organism. Now, it is no secret that the biosphere is suffering from mass extinction. In this anthropocentric era, increased industry and exploitation of land has propelled extinctions at an alarming rate. My team and I believe that humanity has a moral obligation to protect creation, its species, and its ecosystems. Proponents of de-extinction assert that humanity should embrace de-extinction as a conservation effort to make reparations for humanity's harm against species. We argue that de-extinction efforts cannot achieve this goal and instead introduce additional harm which outweigh potential benefits. We will outline 3 arguments which demonstrate that humanity should not embrace de-extinction. First, de-extinction is not an effective approach to conservation. Conservation is defined as the preservation, protection, and restoration of the natural environment and of wildlife. It is forward-looking. You see, conservation biologists assess the current state of nature to preserve and protect its future. The goal of de-extinction, however, is fundamentally different. It is backward-looking, seeking to recreate what is already lost. But it does not actually achieve this goal. Rather, de-extinction is a self-serving placeholder, allowing humanity to feel better for its sins without addressing behaviors that continue to harm existing species. The name de-extinction is misleading. Not a single existing method for de-extinction truly recreates an extinct species. Instead, a proxy or hybrid species is created by gene editing or backward breeding, which merely resembles an extinct one. De-extinction claims to atone for past extinctions, but no such atonement for the lost species ever occurs. De-extinction offers an empty promise. And not only that, but it actively serves as a distraction from the necessary conservation efforts, which will prevent further harm to creation. This brings us to a second argument. Embracing de-extinction would divest resources away from present conservation efforts, leading to continued biodiversity loss. The planet has a finite amount of monetary and natural resources, and it is crucial that these resources be allocated effectively. We already possess conservation methods known to be effective, such as translocation of existing species or restriction on human behavior. De-extinction is a high-risk endeavor that requires a great deal of trial and error. Why spend money on de-extinction attempts that may not even successfully create a single life form when we could allocate funds to legitimate conservation efforts? Research has shown that the potential benefit of de-extinction would be outweighed by cost. And furthermore, the same funding would be better used when allocated elsewhere. Even if a de-extinction effort reaches a degree of success to translocate a population into the wild, the responsibility of maintaining this population will likely fall into the lap of biodiversity managers who are already underfunded. Thus, the monetary and ecological resources already too scarce to protect numerous existing species will be lost to a small population of hybrids whose chances of survival are very slim. Lastly, we argue that de-extinction efforts cause harm to creation on an individual and systemic scale. First, physical harm is inflicted upon surrogates and de-extinct species. While successful cloning and gene editing endeavors have occurred, most cases result in the death of the surrogate, as well as a disproportionate number of deaths among attempted hybrids. Further, the harm caused by de-extinction is not limited to the individual life forms in the lab. While de-extinction biologists may have some understanding as to how a hybrid species will react in a new ecosystem, there is no way to truly understand as to how the hybrid species will react in a new ecosystem. A reintroduced species may prove to be invasive, thus harming the very ecosystem it was designed to save. This raises an additional moral question, ladies and gentlemen. If a de-extinct species becomes invasive, do humans then have a responsibility to re-extint a species? Does it then become human responsibility to decide what species should live and die? De-extinction claims to be an innovative atonement for the wrongs of generations past. However, we assert that the potential benefits of de-extinction do not achieve this goal, and instead divest financial and ecological resources away from effective conservation efforts, all while causing unnecessary harm to individual species, ecosystems, and future generations. For this reason, we affirm that humanity should not embrace the de-extinction of species. Thank you.
Good evening. We believe for today's debate, the most important thing as we look at the question is the framing of the question of de-extinction. Now, our opponents have categorized the question of de-extinction under a framework of fear and proposed harm. That de-extinction will only be applied in ways that have practical viability. De-extinction will operate under a set number of qualifications, which we will show you in our case as we move on. And these qualifications ensure that these perceived harms of our opponents, these loss of life, this vast picture of fear, does not largely occur. Instead, de-extinction will be used, and it is already being used, as a means to secure, protect, and ensure life in the future. Thank you.
Good evening. We'd like to thank you all for attending this debate and for the Pro Team for presenting their case. For many of us, the scene immediately conjured by the word de-extinction takes the form of the failed experiments of Jurassic Park, of the chaos of the night in the museum, or even the woolly mammoth pictured on the JAF debate posters around campus. This picture of humanity crushed beneath its own scientific ambition has been a common feature of Hollywood film and modern literature. Destruction by our own hands is by far the greatest fear pervading experiments pushing human advancement. What we are presenting to you today is not a defense for humanity's detriment, but the reality of de-extinction. An experiment proven successful, a benefit to humanity, and a natural progression of scientific research. Therefore, we negate the resolution and argue that humanity should embrace the de-extinction of species. In order for de-extinction to be most effective, strict parameters are necessary to determine de-extinction candidates. By limiting research to species that have recently gone extinct, we mitigate a major problem that arises from trying to de-extinct, for example, a saber-toothed tiger. This species would have a lot of problems trying to exist in the current ecosystem. For this reason, we do not argue that all species are good candidates for de-extinction. Rather, we propose a careful analysis of species which would survive and benefit current ecosystems. Another concern of de-extinction involves the potential suffering of its subjects. Although de-extinction is a new development in research, all regulations for biological experiments are held to incredibly strict standards for approval and execution. It must not violate international, federal, state, or local laws such as the Animal Welfare Act, which provides the primary set of laws governing the use of animals in research, testing, and teaching in the United States. In addition, the Institutional Animal Care and Use Committee, required by the federal regulations for most institutions involving animal research, actively reviews the animal program, qualification of research personnel, activities in the laboratories, animal welfare in the labs, and protocols. This board must consist of at least one veterinarian and a scientist experienced in animal research. Every action in the process of de-extinction is carefully reviewed by experts in the field for necessity, responsibility, and safety. These provide consistency in research across institutions and labs. With these protocols in place, it is unreasonable to assume that de-extinction poses new ethical threats to research. Another distinction concerns funding for de-extinction. Currently, major de-extinction projects such as Revive and Restore and the Lazarus Project are all privately funded. The issue of research funds, therefore, does not depend upon federal funding grants or competition with conservation efforts, and should not be considered a threat to de-extinction research. It is crucial to recognize that de-extinction is no longer stuck in the theoretical stage. In recent years, the advancement of CRISPR gene editing has expanded the reach of scientific development significantly. Additional technology has allowed for an American native black-footed ferret to be successfully cloned in 2020 from a historic cell line through de-extinction technology. Because the inbreeding of the 18 existing black-footed ferrets makes them vulnerable to pathogens or health disorders, the use of de-extinction offers a crucial solution to the species' survival by reintroducing additional genetic variation. As research into de-extinction progresses, naturally so will our methods and scientific knowledge. Just as space travel forced humanity to push itself to its limits, so will de-extinction research. According to NASA's website, the engineering of LED lights, wireless headsets, advanced water purification system, artificial limbs, and even portable computers were all the result of space travel research. Similarly, de-extinction has the potential to act as a catalyst for new scientific discoveries, and it has already done so with the development of a vaccine to protect Asian elephants from a lethal pathogen threatening the current population. Another key advancement due to de-extinction is reproductive technologies, which can both lower the cost of future de-extinction projects and advance medical science for humanity. One of the best candidates for de-extinction research is the gastric brooding frog, a genus containing 2 species that reproduce gastrically. Scientists are interested in this species because the frog's stomach essentially transforms into a uterus for reproduction, which could offer new insights into organ reprogramming in the current population. Finally, we want to reiterate that de-extinction poses no new ethical concerns to the field of research. Although widely perceived as a tool for resurrection, the process of de-extinction requires a living embryo of similar species in order to carry the DNA of the extinct species. This is therefore a distinct extension to common genetic engineering processes, a widely accepted and used scientific tool. It therefore cannot be described as an instrument for resurrection, but rather a natural progression of a common practice in scientific study. For these reasons, we have argued that de-extinction is a valuable tool for scientific discovery. It is critical to recognize that this technology is nothing unique to current scientific practices. It has proven itself a beneficial technology to be utilized alongside conservation efforts and as a progression of modern research. With discretion and adherence to current bioethical standards, de-extinction has the ability to reintroduce keystone species into the ecosystem. This research, privately funded, poses no threats to conservation funds or other federally funded research. Therefore, we argue that humanity should embrace the de-extinction of species, and we urge you to vote likewise. Thank you.
Good evening. My colleagues on the other team have said that they are not attempting to look back to create species that have previously existed. However, and I would agree with them, they are not creating the actual species as they existed in the wild. They are creating a self-serving placeholder, a species that resembles the pre-existing species, and we call it by that name, but it in truth is not the same species. Now, they have also mentioned that de-extinction poses no threat to humans. I will concede that for the moment, but though perhaps we could debate that, and say that the main problem with de-extinction is not that it poses to humans, it is not likely to cause our extinction, but the suffering it causes to the creatures themselves. Even when de-extinction is successful, as a study by the University of California discovered, the de-extinction of one species causes, on average, the extinction of 2 other species. This obviously creates a net result of negative one species extincted for every species which is supposedly going to be brought back to life. As for cloning, even where the cloning process is successful, and that is not always the case, the chances that a species, that the infant animal or bird or other creature will be able to survive both the gestation period and live a long and happy life are less than 10%. We're causing needless suffering and harm to these species in our futile attempts at scientific necromancy. In conclusion, my opponents have said that de-extinction poses no new ethical problem. I agree with them. The ethical problems that de-extinction poses are in fact very old and have happened again and again in human history. Thank you.
Good evening. I would like to first address one of the issues that our colleagues on the other side brought up. They raised the question of fear. They suggested that our framework is one of fear. I suggest to you that we are not operating in a framework of fear, but in a framework of understanding humanity's role in creation. And I will elaborate that as I proceed this statement. As my colleague Baraka has outlined, humanity should not embrace the de-extinction of species because it acts as an entirely self-serving placeholder, divests from necessary conservation efforts, and poses a physical and moral threat to creation. Now, our first point assumes that de-extinction seeks to combat ecological apocalypse brought on by over-exploitation. As my colleague suggested, de-extinction cannot attain this goal. However, others may argue that de-extinction serves alternative motivations, such as monetary or scientific gain. To this, we must ask, is it just for humans to interfere with the natural order of creation for our own advantage? We answer no. To justify de-extinction by its financial benefit is to deny the intrinsic value of creation and to reduce life forms to profit. As for a scientific justification, as you heard from the other side, it may be suggested that developments in genome editing benefit other fields, such as biomedical research. However, many tools necessary for de-extinction were developed in other fields. For example, CRISPR-Cas9 was developed by a molecular biologist for immune system research. De-extinction is not a necessary process for developing genetic technology. We have further outlined that the misallocation of resources created by interest in de-extinction and that this divestment is not limited to financial resources. According to the guidelines on de-extinction written by the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, de-extinction is only deemed ethical if the de-extinction project intends to translocate the hybrid species into an ecosystem. Thus, adequate land is necessary for ethical de-extinction. Proper ecosystems must exist in the quantity and conditions suitable for de-extinct species. It is crucial to recall that habitat destruction is the leading cause of mass extinction. 20% of the Amazon alone has been destroyed in the last 50 years. Over 1/3 of the Earth's terrestrial surface is appropriated for agriculture. Loss of habitat is responsible for 80% of all decline in biodiversity. The ecosystems to which a proxy might be released are currently being destroyed. My friends, a movement toward de-extinction is futile if humanity is not willing to give up the very thing which makes conservation necessary, our own destructive behavior. There is no justice in creating a species whose home has already been destroyed, that they might suffer before humans show any willingness to address their own harm. Now let us turn to the moral and ethical dangers of embracing de-extinction. Not only does the process cause harm to individuals and ecosystems, but it also has a significant implication for how we understand humanity's role in creation. With the ability to de-extinct species at will, we run the risk of elevating humans to a position of control over other species, that we see ourselves as rightful presiders over the life and death of not only single organisms, but entire species. If we grant ourselves the right to de-extinct and potentially re-extinct species, we are reducing the significance of extinction and even toying with the meaning of death. It leads directly to a framework which says, what reason have we to prevent the extinction of suffering species if we can just bring them back whenever we feel like it? This is dangerous, violent even. In summary, our team has demonstrated that de-extinction is a futile and hazardous endeavor. It does not address the causes of mass extinction, seeking only to make humans feel better about their own exploitation. Interest in de-extinction is entirely self-serving, prioritizing human gain over the intrinsic value of life. The pursuit of de-extinction divests money away from conservation and does not remedy the continued destruction of habitats. Finally, embracing de-extinction threatens to trivialize the relationship between humanity and creation. For these reasons, humanity should not embrace de-extinction. Thank you.
In their arguments, the Pro team attempts to frame de-extinction in a framework of atonement, choosing which species are worthy of life, as a form of playing God. However, if we use this framework the opposing team is using, all science is about atoning for past mistakes. Conservation is trying to atone for our mistakes in endangering species. Further, all science is about answering who should live and who should die. Which endangered species should we allocate resources to in conservation? As you can see, these are questions that are facing all science, not just de-extinction. These are questions that must be answered sooner or later, and if we follow the framework of the Pro team, according to them, all science should be abandoned as a form of playing God. Further, contrary to the claims of the opposing side, de-extinction will not take away funding from conservation. This claim is wrong for several reasons. First, funding for de-extinction and conservation is not a zero-sum game in which increasing funding for de-extinction necessitates an equal decrease in funding for conservation. On the contrary, de-extinction is not funded through conservation funding, but from private donors or institutional grants outside of conservation. For example, Revive and Restore, the foremost wildlife conservation organization supporting de-extinction, has received all funding from private donors or institutional grants outside of conservation. Thus, de-extinction is not in opposition to conservation, but will work in conjunction with conservation to conserve species. A study done by Bennett et al. In 2017 found that in all model simulations when funds for de-extinction were externally sponsored, lowered costs of shared actions would allow more extant species to be prioritized for conservation. In other words, de-extinction leads to a net gain in conservation, not a loss. Moreover, in analysis of the cost of de-extinction, there's a great deal of overestimation, as costs that would exist regardless of de-extinction are calculated in the cost of de-extinction. Ben Novak, lead scientist at Revive and Restore, points out that, quote, a great deal of the initial expenses of de-extinction, particularly in silico research, is completely independent of conservation science. The genomes of extinct species are sequenced regardless of their use by de-extinction programs. In conclusion, de-extinction does not stand in opposition to conservation, but an increase in de-extinction is an increase in conservation efforts.
Good evening, everyone. De-extinction can be most accurately described as recreating an organism that resembles an extinct one to the best of our ability. By its very definition, the species will not be the same. Their importance lies in the interactions they have with their environment. De-extinction is not resurrection, but rather a natural application of several methodologies, of which include cloning, genetic modification, and breeding back a living organism. Here, I will attempt to support our first and second contentions that de-extinction is a viable option to reinvigorate a biodiverse world, and that the research conducted in pursuit of this will prove useful for humanity and other extant, still existing species. We can work diligently to ensure that each candidate species for de-extinction passes a lengthy screening test, which will assess concerns such as diet and habitat needs. Any animal that should be considered for de-extinction should meet very specific criteria. In an article from the Journal of Responsible Innovation, researchers found that, quote, pessimistic views of de-extinction were linked to concerns about unclear development paths, which we have seen from the pro side. For this reason, our team plans to be very transparent in how we believe this technology will best be applied. The animals I present for you today will adhere or will in the future conform to the qualifications below taken from the Revive and Restore project and the IUCN guiding principles. 1, the species in question must have not become extinct too long ago. 2, all their conservation efforts were unsuccessful. 3, the biotic needs of the candidate species are understood well enough to determine critical dependencies and to provide a basis for release area selection. And 4, the potential for negative impacts associated with translocating a species poses an acceptable risk. Through the development of cloning and genetic modification for the purpose of de-extinction, other technologies that benefit humans may be discovered. An example of this is the gastric brooding frog, a unique amphibian that swallowed its eggs and essentially used its stomach as a uterus. The Lazarus Project, headed by Dr. Michael Archer, hopes to bring back this organism in order to study how it reprograms its organs at a cellular level. This could have a great effect on human medicine, providing new ways to deal with stomach ulcers or healing from surgery. It may take a long time to see results in de-extinction research, and it is certainly not yet cost-effective, but the discovery this research would support could be well worth it. In order to decrease the cost of any technology, it must be developed to the point where new and more cost-effective methodologies are discussed. Additionally, de-extinction is necessary to improve upon current conservation methods. It is a well-known fact that despite efforts of conservation biologists, species continue to go extinct every year. Increasing biodiversity in ecosystems all over the planet is necessary for global health. A real-world example is the ivory-billed woodpecker, known as the good Lord bird by ornithologists because that was the common response of those lucky enough to see it flying overhead. Woodpeckers are keystone species because they create habitats for other animals in trees. Biodiversity among woodpecker populations is essential because of their important role in the ecosystem. Of course, it is a popular candidate also because of its awe-inspiring size and remarkable coloring. Bringing back animals could contribute to the health of the ecosystem as a whole. Andrew Pass, professor of genetics in the School of Biosciences at the University of Melbourne, believes in the thylacine, or Tasmanian tiger, could prove the saving grace of Tasmanian devil populations. The thylacine is the natural predator of Tasmanian devils, or it was until it went extinct in 1980, and helped to cull the population of individuals infected with diseases. Without the thylacine, devil facial tumor disease has run rampant through Tasmanian devil populations, putting them on the endangered species list. Bringing back the thylacine could help prevent the extinction of another species. Humans have been modifying animal and plant genomes for millennia. With cloning and genetic technology, we are simply making the process easier and more precise. De-extinction is nothing new. In fact, it is identical to scientific methods related to genetically modified organisms, such as CRISPR technology or cloning animals. De-extinction is only different in its application to repair ecosystems, bring back diversity, and perhaps discover something helpful to human medicine along the way. We oppose the idea that the risk of de-extinction is far too great to attempt. In fact, we propose that the risk is far too great to let this technology sit idle. Beth Shapiro, one of the foremost experts on de-extinction technology, has said, "I would argue, looking at the 20,000 species that are in danger of becoming extinct within the next several decades, it's far riskier not to think about those technologies to allow the science to develop. It's far riskier not to do that because we are going to lose all of this. Conservation efforts are failing species the world over. Biodiversity is dropping, and according to the Smithsonian Museum of Natural History, extinction rates are hundreds of times higher than the baseline rate. De-extinction isn't the first choice in the toolbox, and it must be carefully researched, modeled, and applied in controlled situations, but it must be an option." Thank you.
Thank you. In response to what my colleagues on the opposing team have said, I would pose this question again. Science requires morals. It requires ethics. We are not simply dismissing this case just because we fear it. We do it because we have done the research and we have discerned that without a shadow of a doubt, that de-extinction does more harm than good. The team presently just mentioned about a certain bird who had pretty coloring, and that it would be a great gift for other people to see it. Well, that's only aesthetic value. That's only human value. Where is the value in the ecosystem? Where is the value to the other species? The team has also mentioned the Revive and Restore Project and Lazarus, privately funded organizations who are doing their own research. Well, if they're doing their own research, how is there any regulation from governments, from lobbyists, from animal rights advocates? While there is an open forum and they do advocate for de-extinction, there is less regulation involved. And privately funded organizations have less morals and have less restrictions to abide by this. Further, I would argue that introducing a new species still poses a risk of being invasive. Examples, the kudzu vine, the swamp rat. These were endangered species and some non-endangered species that were introduced by humanity to help the ecosystem, and they proved to be more invasive. I argue that it is not that de-extinction is bad or inherently flawed, it is just that it is fraught with a lack of concern for morals and ethics for the ecosystem. It is important that we as Christians and as scientists and as future generations, that we must protect ourselves as well as others from the damage that de-extinction can pose and cause to others. Thank you.
Well, we have some time now for questions from our audience. And those of you who are watching virtually are free to send a question to jaf@gordon.edu, and Kat will be monitoring that address. Those in the auditorium, you can also raise your hand and if you have a question, and I will recognize you, and then you can approach one of the two microphones. We ask that you use the microphone so that the people at home can hear what you're asking. We ask also that you keep your mask on and that you not touch the mic. And just recall that we are looking for specific, relatively succinct questions that are directed at one team or to the other. So, who has a question? Yes, up there. Yes. And maybe as you ask when you ask your question, just also identify yourself. Say who you are.
Hi, I'm Caroline Lavoie. I'm a JAF alum. Oh, it doesn't work. Okay. I have a question for the negative team. This keeps turning off. You were saying that funding for de-extinction usually comes from private donors, but you're arguing for the embrace of de-extinction. So wouldn't that necessarily be in part a financial embrace, and therefore would necessarily draw funds away from other places?
Yeah, so I think that's a great point. The important thing to recognize is saying that humanity should embrace something doesn't necessitate that it's going to be funded by the federal government. We can say we embrace, whatever things we embrace that spaghetti is a great food, or we embrace research into cells, whatever it is. I can't think of an example right now off the top of my head, but definitely anything that we embraced by humanity, does not necessitate funding by the federal government. Funding can always come from private donors, and can come from other institutional grants. Furthermore, again, the fact that funding is being used for de-extinction does not mean that funding is being taken away from conservation. There's a false dichotomy that somehow if the funding that's giving to de-extinction, all this funding, look at all this money, that should be put into conservation. However, it's not transferable like that. People gave money to de-extinction organizations for de-extinction. There's no way to look at that money and say, wow, that $1 million, that should go to conservation. That's not going to happen because these private donors gave it specifically for de-extinction. And as stated before, funding for de-extinction is completely separate from conservation, and embracing does not necessitate federal support. Thank you.
A question right here on the floor.
Good evening. My name is Michelle. I have a question for the negative team. How does the negative team address the accusation that by controlling which species to de-extinct or to allow to go extinct, that they're elevating humans to the role of playing God?
Just keep talking until they get the mic working.
Well, so first thing that I would like to point to is that this is a question that does not only affect the extinction. This question is all across all of science, and particularly in conservation. There are species problem is directly linked to the lack of an apex predator, the lack of a predator above them, their overpopulation. That's where the problem is coming from. So if you kind of understand, it's not humans making a decision, oh, this species we like better, this species is more cute, you know, this particular mammoth is a lot more cute. That's not what the decisions are based on. The decisions are based upon practical, reasonable effects that work to save life in general.
Kat, a question from home.
Hello, everyone. I don't know if you can hear me online, but this is a question for the pro team from Paul Stapleton, a 2013 JAF debate alum. There we go. The pro team several times discussed the dangers of introducing invasive species, as well as introducing species into environments already largely destroyed or being in the process of being destroyed. Does this not also apply to human beings having children? Human beings, the most invasive species, and being born into a world suffering man-made ecological disasters.
Hello? Can you hear me? I'm just going to project. There we go. In response to that question about humans being the ultimate invasive species, that we kind of are. Biblically, we were created by God and placed on the earth, and God gave us dominion over the earth as stewards for both the living creatures and the land and the sea. But because of that, we are also in a fallen world because of the fall and original sin, and some people have done violations against creation, against animals, and against our ecosystems. Therefore, we believe that it's important that we try to find a in ways that don't necessarily cause more harm to the existing creation that's already there. Also, just to address invasive species in environments. So if we were to bring back a de-extinct species, one example is the passenger pigeon. That is one of the most well-known, next to the woolly mammoth, about bringing back alive. The passenger pigeon was hunted into extinction because it was a pest to the rest of its ecosystem. It was flocking in millions upon millions of migratory patterns, causing destruction to not only farmland, but also to the nearby environments, the chestnut tree population. And bringing that back could reintroduce an invasive species. So we're trying our best that sometimes God calls away certain species for a specific reason. And by having ourselves try to reintroduce it back into the population, we might be causing more harm than good. Also, even if the species is successful in trying to heal the ecosystems that it's supposed to heal, we still have air pollution. We still have human-caused issues that are way more damaging and that really need to be prioritized over something that is just very small and not really prone to do much. Even if you were to do some healing with like the Tasmanian devil, which I think is great, that doesn't address the deforestation of its home. It doesn't address the air pollution. It doesn't address water pollution. It doesn't address all these much bigger issues that we need to be focusing on, that need our attention. Thank you.
Megan?
Hi, my name's Megan. I'm a JAF alum, and I have a question for the affirmative side. So the negative case talked about how it's an individual choice or private business or private loans that are funding the de-extinction of species. If you're saying that they should not embrace that, what would be your plan to address private investment into this study?
Hello. Thank you for your question. So, the main reason that we oppose the de-extinction of species and we believe it should not be embraced is because we believe it is unethical. We believe that it causes harm. And when things in science are unethical and they cause harm, then we believe it is the role of the government to suspend the practice of these processes that are unethical and cause harm. So obviously, our opinion is that we should set up regulations that prevent you from doing unethical things that cause harm to animals, that cause harm to environments, and that could even potentially cause harm to humans.
The moral and ethical case of de-extinction, it does not revolve around, as our opponents would suggest, a framework of humans doing something that seeks their self-interest, something that is best for humanity. That's not what the moral implications of de-extinction revolve around. In fact, de-extinction, it relates to our commission by God to have, in having dominion over the earth, as he proclaimed in Genesis, we are responsible for protecting creation and responsible for doing things that serve life in general. Now, de-extinction, it doesn't work to serve directly, human interests in that you are, I guess, operating under that framework. What de-extinction does is and under the qualifications that we have provided, it would serve life in general. And I think Jacob, he does have kind of some of the moral, or I'm sorry, I think Kate does. Yeah, Kate has some other ethical arguments, but basically what I'm and our side is arguing is that it provides for a more of doing a good to protect the earth, to provide for it, and to sustain it.
If I could just speak from here. I think that in our opening statement, we made it clear that there are no new ethical problems that are raised by de-extinction. One of the points of the pro case was that the harm caused to the surrogate would invalidate de-extinction as a viable science. But if you follow that train of logic, you'd have to get rid of all animal testing because according to the Animals Act of 1986, at the end of a series of regulated procedures, the animals used must be killed immediately by
I apologize, everyone up there. If you could go to the front mic to respond, the people online cannot hear you. So from here on. Pursue de-extinction efforts if the original conditions that led to extinction are still present.
So to answer that question, that basically de-extinction is pointless, right? Because if species are brought back, they'll simply go extinct again. On the contrary, it's most likely the case that species will have a better chance at survival when brought back from de-extinction. Now, when I go into this, I want to make it clear again that there's specific criteria. We're not talking about species like dinosaurs that have been gone millennia ago. Of course, those species, when they come back, is a whole different world. It's not going to be good for them. However, when we keep the criteria that we are de-extincting species that have not been extinct for too long, they will actually have a better chance of survival. For example, compared to when these species went extinct, scientists have a much better understanding of the reasons for why certain species went extinct and what can be done in order to prevent extinction from occurring again. Furthermore, the dangers of reintroducing de-extinct species back to the wild is no different from other conservation efforts such as rewilding, which reintroduce species into ecosystems. So should reintroducing species into the wild be discontinued due to the potential risks involved? Absolutely not. And instead, what matters is doing extensive research and preparation to reintroduce the extinct species back to their ecosystems as safely as possible. And a specific example of this is, once again, with mammoth research. Researchers right now are finding a strain of elephant herpes virus that was killing the mammoths and also is killing Asian elephants currently. Research into de-extinction has allowed them to start the process of culturing this disease, and also which will lead the way for a vaccine against this virus, which will allow mammoths, when they come back, to have a better chance of survival than they did before, because then now they are vaccinated against this virus. And additionally, just a peripheral gain is that Asian elephants now also will be safe from this virus as well.
My name is Devin, and I'm a JAF alum. My question is for the affirmative case. So a cornerstone of your argument has been the possible reintroduction of invasive species. However, with the reality of de-extinction efforts that the negative case has presented, like the conditions that need to be met, that no other conservation efforts have worked, that there's a proper understanding of the effects of reintroduction, what is your response? Because a lot of your argument stemmed on something that seems to be not applicable considering the restrictions around actual reintroduction. Thank you.
Thank you for that question, Devin. I would first of all argue that our argument around the reintroduction of species into the wild and the issue of them being invasive was actually not the primary argument. We're extremely concerned about the morals around de-extinction. But when you do consider the behavior that the reintroduced species could have in the ecosystem, there is no way for us to actually know the way that they would act. As the negative team, has themselves affirmed, the species that is introduced is just a proxy species. We do not know if it will be completely the same. We do not know how it will act. And we anticipate that there would be a lot of cases in which the behavior of the species would not be what we expect, and we simply do not have the time ecologically in the face of global warming to be expending resources on introducing species into ecosystems that are already collapsing. And so we see that this is too much of a risk for us to go down that path. Thank you.
Tragically, we are finished with our Q&A from the floor portion. We want to give them a little bit of time to ask questions of each other. The same rules apply to you guys. Keep your questions succinct. This is not an opportunity to make another big statement. We'll start with the con side and then the other until a few minutes have elapsed.
Hello. So you guys were arguing that there is no point in bringing back a species whose home has already been destroyed. I would like to ask a question about that. What if we were to bring back something like the American chestnut, which would create a habitat for existing species and species we might potentially want to bring back. One more thing about that, that species is functionally extinct.
Thank you for that question. So I can understand what you're saying is de-extinction doesn't only apply to animals, it can also apply to plants who can provide habitats. Well, it is possible that a plant can provide habitats for, say, de-extinct animals and try to cause some healing for the ecosystem and for the environment so that a de-extinction animal can have a better environment. However, the same concept still applies with risk, because there is an example of invasive plants, plants who are introduced into an ecosystem and who overtake the vegetation, change the ecosystem, and deplete natural resources from other members of the ecosystem. Again, I would like to argue that introducing another de-extinct species to make it better for another de-extinct species could cause a domino effect, where we soon realize that we need to improve the ecosystems through the same process, and we're continuously just changing the ecosystem. Humans are continuously invading the ecosystems, invading with the natural process, and as a result, we may not be getting the results that we want. We may not even have a sustainable environment that can be done through this method. In other words, we have to focus on other priorities, like limiting human damage. We're just adding human damage through this process because we're just adding more organisms to an environment that already has finite resources that will be further depleted if they are introduced. Thank you.
Also, when the species is de-extincted, then we've merely foisted another problem onto the conservationists who already have, as we have mentioned before, limited resources. And these resources, these limitations, are not simply that of funding, but also that of personnel, that of time. These are also resources which are not quite so fluid as funding. Thank you.
The practitioners of current de-extinction projects will believe that our current technology cannot fully support creating a functional proxy, and it will even take years and decades to achieve the biodiversity gain that you guys mentioned. So we believe that introducing a species into an unpredictable future ecosystem may have unforeseen negative effects. Is there any evidence, model simulation, or empirical data to prove that there will be the conservation gain for ongoing projects? And I mean ongoing, not past projects. And how can you possibly predict the interactions between the proxy and other species in its unknown future ecosystem? Thank you.
Thank you so much for that question, Grace. So the question, if I could just rephrase it, is basically asking, is there any actual evidence that rewilding an essentially extinct species will have any gain for an ecosystem and not just completely decimate any extant species in there? And the answer is yes. There's actually an example in the Yellowstone National Park. Wolves were essentially extinct from the environment. Now, scientists examined what the potential effect of wolves being reintroduced to the environment would be, and they realized that it would have an extremely reinvigorating effect on the ecosystem, on an essentially dying ecosystem. Now, wolves aren't an extinct species in general, but they were in this ecosystem. And comparing rewilding, what we're proposing, rewilding an extinct species to the general ecosystem, can be modeled on that small scale in Yellowstone National Park, and it did work. Yes, there are definitely cases where it will not, but that can be predicted, and that can be modeled ecologically, but that risk is not worth just pulling back all those resources where you could potentially reinvigorate whole ecosystems. So the answer is yes to your question. There have been examples of this happening. Thank you.
We move now to our final concluding statements, and we begin with the affirmative case.
Thank you all for coming tonight and engaging on this topic with us. Tonight, you all stand before a choice, one that is not simply between the pro team and the negative team, but, ladies and gentlemen, this evening you have a choice between ideas firmly rooted in reality, seeking to preserve and protect a suffering planet, and ideas which employ nostalgia in place of accountability. As both sides have mentioned, and by now you know, de-extinction is possible. So the question we're asking tonight is not whether we can embrace de-extinction, but whether we should. The pro team has repeatedly affirmed that de-extinction is privately funded, and it has been addressed in the Q&A. A study conducted in New Zealand in 2017 finds that even if conservation efforts are privately funded, the result is a net loss in terms of biodiversity. In fact, the same money invested into conservation efforts will surely yield 2 to 8 times the amount of increase in biodiversity than it does when it comes to de-extinction. Another point the negative side has repeatedly failed to address is what conservation biologist Stuart Prim brings up in his 2013 study. The history of putting species back after they've gone extinct in the wild is fraught with difficulty. Having the species solves only a tiny, tiny, tiny part of the whole problem. In other words, bringing a single individual back without ensuring that the whole species could sustainably be introduced in a current ecosystem is not de-extinction as defined by the IUCN, as previously mentioned, and is incredibly self-serving and anthropocentric. Moving on, I would like to invite you to use your imagination in a picture that is very fond to me, that of a woolly mammoth. Right off the top of our heads, we would probably picture it in a landscape of a rolling tundra. This charismatic, hulking beast would be grazing lazily amongst the Arctic wildflowers. Coming back to reality, the year 2021, where we are attempting to fight the peril of global warming, where habitat destruction is occurring at the startling rate of 260 acres per hour, we have to realize that the sheer magnitude of the ecological crisis we are facing is overwhelming, and it is high time for us to respond in an effective manner. But de-extinction simply is not a valuable method to do so. Firstly, this is the case because, due to data from the University of California that indicates that an investment in de-extinction is actually a decrease in biodiversity, as we have stated numerously. It actually decreases the biodiversity of fauna and flora. The second reason is that we are simply running out of time. 30,000 species become extinct every year, and de-extinction's contribution of merely a couple individuals after 40 years of de-extinction research just isn't enough. Humanity needs to focus on conservation attempts that address mass extinction directly. Lastly, de-extincting individuals does not equate de-extincting a species. The little success we've had de-extincting individuals is virtually meaningless in terms of conservation. Dr. Gill of the University of Maine puts it this way: is a lonely calf raised in captivity and without the concept of its herd and environment really a mammoth? Does it not matter that there are no mammoth matriarchs to nurse the calf, to inoculate it with the necessary gut bacteria, to teach it how to care for itself, to teach it where ancestral migration paths are. Does it not matter that the permafrost is melting? De-extinction without significant regard for the complexity of our ecosystem is a death wish for the individuals we have just brought back to life. But perhaps most importantly, embracing de-extinction would display sheer disregard for the finality of death and the gravity of extinction. We would be creating a consequence-free reality in which our destructive behaviors are stripped of their significance because of the foolhardy belief that we have the right to disrupt the natural order of creation and to make up for our mistakes. Ladies and gentlemen, I ask you to consider the terms of this debate earnestly and not to be enticed by the grand spectacle of de-extinction. Tonight, the negative side has had the responsibility to persuade each and every one of you that despite all the dangers of de-extinction that we have elicited, it is somehow still sensible for humanity to lurch forward in our selfish and anthropocentric attempt to disturb the dead and interfere with the natural order of creation. They have painted the idealistic picture of a future that does not take reality or morality into perspective. If, though, you recognize the self-serving, hubris-infested nature of these pursuits, their complete disregard for the suffering it brings about in individuals, populations, and entire ecosystems, all for a practice that we don't even agree is effective, you must agree with the affirmative. I urge you all to weigh both sides carefully and conclude what must be concluded. It is simply not rational for humanity to embrace the de-extinction of species. Thank you.
Good evening. Quote, Earth is currently experiencing a biodiversity crisis. Recent estimates suggest that extinction threatens up to 1 million species of plants and animals. Historically, there have been 5 mass extinction events. Now we are heading towards another. What makes this one different is that it is not naturally caused. Rather, human activities such as deforestation and pollution are the primary cause. Humans have radically changed the course of history. We have pushed planetary boundaries almost to their tipping points, and there is a short window of time in which we can counteract this damage. It is imperative how we recognize the extent of biodiversity loss is shaping our world and take collective responsibility to combat it. This is something we have all agreed upon in the context of this debate. Now the question is, what will we do with this information and how will we move forward? This debate is not just about the ethics of de-extinction. It is about the application of scientific knowledge for practical purposes. Even in light of the evidence that the other team has presented, we encourage you to negate the resolution along with us. De-extinction, when done within the parameters we have proposed, could be an avenue to the flourishing of people and the planet. As you have witnessed tonight, our team has successfully refuted the arguments against us in ways that I will now outline. The other team holds that the unanticipated risks involved with these technologies warrant a rejection to embrace their potential. In addition, they have misconstrued our arguments. We did not propose bringing back the mammoth. Within our guidelines, species that we want to bring back are under a realistic set of parameters. This is precisely the reason that we must be smart about using this technology, cautiously following a step-by-step plan and creatively reacting to any problems we encounter. While the potential for species to become invasive or increase the risk of animal disease is there, this is something we are equipped to respond to. Please note that any time species are introduced into environments that are new, we will design objectives that align with particular goals, implement these, and be prepared to monitor the situation, assessing outcomes. If needed, we can implement exit strategies, which will be designed in the planning process. If re-extinction were to become a threat, we would see the population beginning to decline and be able to reassess our investment in the project. or each project individually. While we must recognize that these technologies have the potential to harm us, a cost-benefit analysis yields that investing in this enterprise is worthwhile. We know it's possible, but also it poses no new ethical problems. These technologies, cloning, gene editing, backbreeding, are already used. The only thing that's different is that we're using them to bring species back that are extinct. I want to assert that this is not toying with death. In addition, this team has said that the role we have in the environment is to be the pinnacle of creation, but they have also said that our role is not to be the pinnacle of creation. So I'm a little bit confused as to that. Furthermore, the other team has asserted that our time and money should be invested elsewhere. However, de-extinction should be seen as a tool that serves to advance conservation rather than detracting from its purpose. We believe that potential proxy species should be considered on a case-by-case basis and chosen by experts to ensure that our investment in de-extinction projects is maximized. The International Union for the Conservation of Nature states, quote, "Our priority should remain the preservation and enhancement of existing biodiversity, with proxy species creation being undertaken only when consistent with these principles," end quote. Ever since humans began to walk the earth, we have been manipulating ecosystems, especially after the advent of agriculture. Under their arguments, we wouldn't be able to manipulate ecosystems in that way, which would be impossible for us to live. As we continue to grow in our understanding of the world, developing and using technology for our benefit, we should stop to consider how other species are impacted by our choices. We must come to realize that human thriving depends on planetary thriving, and this should call us to a posture of humility and creativity. While we acknowledge that investing in this research is a risk, we believe that it is not an uninformed one. In essence, the affirmative side has argued that the costs of de-extinction outweigh the benefits. However, they have not given full consideration to the potential outcomes. De-extinction is not the ultimate fix for a world in which biodiversity is disappearing at an alarming rate, but it is a tool alongside other initiatives to reverse climate change, prevent habitat destruction, and most importantly, enlighten the public about the importance of conservation. In conclusion, we should thoughtfully and intentionally engage with this technology, viewing it as an opportunity to promote the well-being of humans and the wider biological community. Thank you.
All right, thank you, both sides. We now have a duty to undertake. It's time to vote. So I am going to ask both of our teams to exit stage right while we do a little democracy. Now, I want to reiterate that you are not voting on the basis of affinity to particular people or even on your own opinion on the matter at hand, but rather on who you believe made the most compelling case for their position. Those of you who are in the auditorium will be voting by the raising of hands. Those watching virtually can vote by typing the address that is on the screen or by clicking the Cast Your Vote link that you may have received in the invitation email to this event. So think about it and don't be swayed by your neighbors, those sitting around you. And for those in the room, if you raise your hands, we have counters. I'll start with the pro team, the affirmative case. If you believe the affirmative side made the most compelling case, please raise your hand and keep it high. All right, and the con team If you think the negative side made the strongest case, please raise your hand and keep it high. We're still waiting for the votes to come in from the people at home. So talk amongst yourselves, 6 feet across. They're going to come in. Let's give them a hand as they do. Well, wait till they're coming in the door, Megan. All right, we have a winner. We have a winner to announce. I first want to thank some folks. Thanks to the good people at CTS. I also want to thank members of the natural science faculty, and in particular the biology department, who gave all sorts of advice to Dr. Evelyn Harper and I in the original, as we put this together, and then I'm sure have been pestered by these folks over the past semester. So thanks to them. Thanks also to Joanna Wells, who gets this event going and probably never knew she was going to be spraying for a living with this part of this job. So thanks also to this folks. The win goes to the con team, who did very well and was the resounding choice of the audience. So congratulations to the negative case. Thank you all for coming, and have a good evening.